one other thing that I wanted to ask is, so we've sort of laid the land. Can you also identify what it's like to kind of cope? What can these women do? Like, is there anything that they can do in a closed, confined space? So I mean, I was talking to a couple of people, and they don't have a garden to go to. They don't have any, external place to go to. What other places can they sort of at least mentally resign to when there's such a situation? Because the harm to the body is one thing, but I think the stress to the mind, how can they figure that part out? And then we'll come to some practical solutions.
Sure. So this is actually a trick question, because on one hand, we're thinking, okay, great. How do we give them tools so that they manage to actually just cope and live in abuse, which is partially what's culturally been going on for decades and decades and decades. And that's equally as dangerous as just, saying, let's just allow them to be abused. On the other hand, they really need those tools. So there's a really big fine line in between these things. But what I will say is the biggest predominant perpetuator of abuse is shame. So the biggest thing that we can actually give these women is empower them to speak up. Having said that, there are a lot of restrictions there, but it might be to a family member. A lot of women actually deal with abuse privately in their bedrooms, and they live in these joint family systems. And even though the household is small, the house living spaces are small, outside of the bedroom door, they don't know. The mother-in-law, the sister-in-laws, they don't know. And these women experience such severe shame to speak. And shame is something that actually grows and nurtures abuse, because it gives all the more power to the abuser. So if there can be some more dialogue, if there can be messages that are coming in, when we start to look at things at a policy level, just recognizing that right now the stakes are so high, abuse is thriving in these abuse households. Maybe looking at some of the Western policies that have been implemented, where, in countries in Europe, you can be fined for breaking the lockdown laws, but not if you're a woman, not if you're experiencing abuse, not if you're a child who's experiencing abuse. Exceptions are made because there's a huge recognition of this. And even that itself is not enough, but it's a start.
So if we can, identify, Sanya, one more time for a recap, just in case we missed the beginning. If you can give us a recap on what your domestic workers who you're hiring at Mauqa.Online are going through. So one of the three things you can identify: A, they're, for example, living in closed, confined spaces in really tiny rooms that are divided into sub-rooms. B, they are getting beaten by their husbands. C, they're being normalized. And by the way, I think Jasleen and Sanya, we need to recognize here that the abuse isn't necessarily perpetrated by the men in the household. You mentioned mother-in-laws and sister-in-laws, but sometimes the normalization and the shame also gets perpetrated by the women in the house who see the man as their source of income and support. So, Sanya, can you just recap for us in case somebody missed out the beginning of what your organizations, domestic workers and employees are going through in terms of human dignity?
Sure. So our helpers at the moment are just confined to their homes, whereas they'd be able to at least get out for 4 to 8 hours a day while working at Mauqa. They're currently not at Mauqa. The majority of our helpers are Christians, so a lot of them used to go to their church, especially just during the day if they felt the need to just pray and if they're going through anything. They're not able to do that either. So they are literally at home. They have husbands who are unemployed at the moment. They have 3 to 5 kids, and their day literally just starts and ends with taking care of the kids, being in one bedroom, using a common kitchen and using a common bathroom. And they get one phone call in a day from our company, which is from someone in our team that asks them how their day is. And that's usually a 2 to 3 minute phone call. And that's pretty much the only connection they have out of their immediate family that they have.
And it's worth repeating here that your organization is one of the first in Pakistan to give labor laws sanctity to domestic workers in Pakistan, because previously there have been several cases where underage workers have been hired and killed, either killed or deeply wounded enough to get a emergency hospital visit from
Yes.
respectable members of society, right?
I'd just like
Um,
to add
yeah.
that at Mauqa, we require everybody to be over the age of 18. We're very strict about that. We also provide our helpers with mobile bank accounts. And we have seen the change and the confidence in women when they get that ATM card and they know that they can control how much money they can take out on each visit. A lot of them used to say they used to hide their money. Some of them had husbands who were drug addicts who would find where the stash of money was hidden and they would just take it and spend it on drugs. So we saw that difference. One other thing that we do at Mauqa is that we allow our helpers to rate our customers. So while customers can rate helpers, helpers can actually rate customers and even tell us if they don't want to go to a certain customer's house again. We don't judge why, but we have an algorithm that takes that into account. And I remember initially when we used to tell our helpers this, they didn't believe us. And they were like, no, you're just saying this to get us onto Mauqa. You'll still send us to somebody's house, even if they're verbally abusive. And when they realized that we actually meant what we said, they couldn't believe it. And that actually became one of the strongest points for helpers to refer people that they know onto our platform as well.
That's fantastic, because I think it's not just the fact that, people might be facing sexual abuse when they go into a house where perhaps only men are, or men, or, somebody, like sexual abuse is extremely common when there are domestic workers present in a house. And kind of it goes with the territory, but it's also emotional and verbal abuse in the sense that if a particular domestic worker is treated badly or is insulted constantly in their work, also that played in a big role with Mauqa in terms of providing dignity. I want to go back to you, Jasmyn. What about confined spaces and women earning, particularly when it comes to intersectional women who are poor and below the poverty line, makes men so angry? Is there any insight that we can get into the abuse of privilege that men have that can help us, work on the epidemic, I would say, of domestic violence, which already the government had underplayed before? Because 9 out of 10 women, according to the Thomson Reuters, are going to face violence in Pakistan, and so now that's gone up, which means more people are dying indoors. But what is it about toxic masculinity that we can understand that can give us some insight? Can you run us through some of the things that happen within closed confined spaces for men who are supposed to be powerful?
Yeah, actually, see, there's no way of empowering women without also empowering men. And this sounds really ironic because really we're looking at, masculinity encroaching on women's rights and abuse. But when a powerful woman, or a woman who's just earning or providing, or who's able to access some semblance of independence, or is threatening to a man, it's coming out of a deep-rooted insecurity. And this insecurity is for many reasons, but the most predominant reason being a cultural one, where we have these fixed gender roles, and there is an assumption that the man should be the provider. And economically, in many SCS backgrounds, this is just not possible anymore. And so when these gender roles are challenged, the deep insecurity and insufficiency and lack of sense of self that men feel and they don't acknowledge and they don't know how to work through results in extreme forms of abuse. And then the woman is left to be providing. She's left with the domestic part of the work as well, because for a man to even be engaged in that is threatening to their ego, which is really meaning it's just a form of insecurity to be doing female work. And then the woman is also left with the mental load of everything. Running the whole house, she's left to cater to the man's insecurities as well. And that's a big cultural thing over here, where women from every single SCS background have different rhetoric and ways of saying how to make their man feel more empowered and secure.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Jasmyn, because every time a man beats a woman, the old wives get together and they basically talk about how she's incapable of keeping him happy. The entire onus of his mental health is on a woman, so she has to do something either put out or like, keep him happy or, keep him intellectually and creatively. They want the woman to be a full-on woman and a full-on village and a full-on organization and an institute and everything else, in addition to being just an individual, to make sure he's not upset.
Absolutely. And
why
when
does society do that, and how unfair is it?
Yeah, well, look, it comes from generations and generations of imbalance in gender roles. But really, when we do that, what we're actually doing is we're disempowering men to own their own insecurities and work through them. So, as women, we have taken that on, where we have the mothers and the mother-in-laws and daddies and the nannies and everyone promoting this idea that if the man feels bad or if he's having a tantrum or if he's lashing out or being abusive, the onus of that is on the woman. And then women do bend over backwards catering to this, whether that's quitting their jobs or even in high SCS backgrounds, that's women who don't want to earn more than their husband, even in very progressive.
Dumb themselves down, essentially, yeah.
Yeah, and so then as women, we become the keeper of men's insecurities. And actually, we're doing a disservice to ourselves, because until men aren't faced with handling and managing their insecurities themselves, we're basically raising our boys in a way where we say your insecurities are on us and we will shrink ourselves so that you can feel bigger. And then, of course,
but does it even help, Jasmyn? I mean, there are a lot of women who've shrunk themselves. It doesn't really end because insecurity can grow in proportion to a woman shrinking herself. This is a, yeah. I mean, like, just because you're completely small, it doesn't mean the man won't beat you.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not a sustained solution. Nothing good comes out of it. You shrinking yourself so someone else can feel bigger. They're not actually feeling bigger because they have a secure, healthy sense of self. They're just feeling bigger because you're feeling smaller. And when you say, I'm bigger than you, it's just another way of saying, I'm not good enough. Because if I'm good enough, I don't need to be bigger than you. So really all that's happening is that we are nurturing and growing this entire role of being the keepers of men's insecurities.
I completely agree. I have 3 helpers that I can think of off the top of my head who wanted to join Mauqa, but they were not allowed to by their father-in-law, because the father-in-law couldn't take the fact that his daughter-in-law might potentially earn more than his son, and forbade them from joining us.
So yeah, the permission culture is the other issue. Sometimes, Saniya, when I look at resources that Pakistani women can have for domestic violence help, right? A lot of these resources sound to me extremely white. I mean, have a safety bag, have someone to call the state, the domestic violence helpline. I mean, these are extremely white, privileged things that don't really apply in our society. Where you're going to take the safety bag? First of all, where you're going to hide the safety bag in a tiny 3x3 cubicle house, right? Secondly, where are you going to run off to? Third, your own family is going to send you back. In Pakistan's context, specifically the one that we're talking about, do women in the area that you've taken in terms of the industry of domestic help, Saniya, do you even see them having a solution?
No, they actually have absolutely no solution. The solution is just putting up with it. They try not to confide in anyone. They try to completely normalize it by blaming other people, other women for their husband's abuse issues. A couple of them who are even married to drug addicts say, yes, my husband's a drug addict. He steals money from my purse. But you know what? At least he doesn't beat me. So they've got this strange kind of different degrees of abuse that they can live with, and they all just say, no, we're going to live with the husband. We can't go back to our homes. How can we go back? No one will support us. We'll be stigmatized if we leave him.
Yeah, in that context, Jasmyn, I think what Saniya is describing here is what we know typically as Stockholm syndrome, where you kind of make your abuser more powerful than they are in your own head, so that you don't have to feel the indignity of it. What is the solution? I mean, is there really no solution, or can any woman stand up for herself no matter what her resources?
So, honestly, like Saniya just said, yeah, there's no immediate solution, but and there's no solution at our fingertips, especially at a time like this when abuse rates probably are soaring and people, families living in one bedroom homes are not allowed to leave their house. But there is a systemic long-term solution. And, you know, many of us, at least me on my local phone here, we get periodic messages about Corona and how to wash your hands and, you know, various tips like this. But this is the ideal and ultimate time where even if the government fails to provide resources, if they fail to provide funding, if they fail to, you know, do all the things that right now the Western world is trying to do, they can at least start spreading awareness. So there can be messages coming through to our phone, how violence against women or children or beating up is wrong, and what violence is and what it isn't, and how even threats are violence. And that will actually spark us, it will be reaching men and women, and it might not have an immediate response, but what will happen is the shame will start to be lifted, where women feel empowered enough to say, what you're doing to me is not okay. I don't have to comply to all these generations and generations of defenses where, you know, it's okay to be beaten, or it's only seldomly, or yeah, I have to hide it to protect my man. All of the cultural norms will start to evolve, and that's something.
You know, we are talking about domestic violence within the context of intersectional women and below the poverty line women. But frankly, I think a lot of privileged women also have the same exact, you know, boundaries that they cannot jump over from, you know, the stories that we are, you know, hear about our female head of state once in a while who, you know, talked about, I mean, there are these secret things that she would, you know, Benazir Bhutto would come in battered sometimes. They are stories about women parliamentarians who have normalized it. I mean, sometimes the parliament itself, you know, the way the males in the parliament, you know, refer to women, body shame them. And then there's this massive culture in the newspapers about how reporting on domestic violence actually goes. It's like, it's always got this like, you know, yeah, woman dies because husband beat her up, you know. And the husband goes scot-free because apparently, like, I don't know, there's always some solution to it. So it's not just within the context of poverty. I think it's in the context of really rich women, really empowered women, really women who can, you know, run off on a yacht will still stay. And so I think what we need to identify now is, Jasleen, the point, the point that you said is like, women need to speak up, because that is when the shame is transferred from the man to the woman, from the woman to the man, right? I mean, it's like suddenly you're no longer protecting your oppressor. Suddenly the oppressor is over there, even if you look like a basket of fruits, battered and bruised. The fault is on the man. Would you admit that that is where the pivot is?
Absolutely. So this is a very, very valid point you brought up, because women who have all the means and resources and might have very independent careers and very progressive families backing them will not leave. They will not speak. They're all the more likely to not actually speak about their abuse than women from lower SES backgrounds, because women from
They have
lower
more to lose. Mm-hmm.
yeah, they have more to lose, but also they're exposed to this Western idea of abuse and the concept of it. So there's even more shame, whereas women from lower SES backgrounds can sometimes easily use defenses like humor, ya chalo theek hai, sabke saath hota hai to hamare saath hota hai to kaun si badi baat hai, you know, they normalize it. And but women from higher SES backgrounds who have some awareness of abuse, they're more likely to hide their abuse. And really, what the point you're making is that it's an emotional issue. Yes, as a third world country, limited resources, absolutely, the practicalities matter, but the emotional issue needs to be addressed. And something so powerful, like when I was living in Australia, they have taken such a huge crackdown on abuse that every 10 minutes there's an advertisement on TV that says something like, to violence against women, Australia says no. They have plastered it everywhere, that really when you get a message from a state level, it has some impact. You know, it has
Unfortunately, Jasleen, on our state level, we only reinforce gender norms. I mean, our leaders basically sit out there and say that the best woman is a woman who's the best mother. You know, so this massive concept of, you know, not being good enough at what you do, providing sanction for a beating, you know, for example, burning the food. Sanya, do you think the pivot is emotional counseling? Do you think that that could be a solution that we can propose at the end of today's podcast? Because I want at the end to have this to be a call for either organizations to help women in domestic violence for your organization and others. But I also want us to have mentors and perhaps mental health professionals such as Jasmyn offering counseling to these women, or offering some kind of you know package of awareness that it is not them. And it is so hard to do that, but at least by talking about it right now we can create a start. So to summarize, what are the three things that you think can pivot the women in your organization?
I think it is some sort of emotional counseling to let them know that this is not okay, this is not normal, and whatever they've been hearing while growing up, maybe seeing it with their parents and now experiencing the same thing with their husbands, it is a cycle that they can break out of. And it is something that they need to also, not just for them, but also for their daughters. Their daughters also need to be part of this conversation. A lot of them get married.
So that's one. I think what we can do here, Jasmyn and Sanya, we can agree on using this as a call for mental health professionals to come forward and help organizations like Mauqa. So that's one. Two, do you think financial immediate, because look, COVID is a pandemic that the world has never experienced before. This is like really extraordinarily sad conditions that we're all living in. How does direct money transfers into their mobile wallets, can that help empower them through the local economy, because they can't come to collect it?
That can, but the thing is, right now, retailers and all are shut, so they're not able to get their money. They have to get to an ATM machine, which is a hassle at the moment, because if their husband doesn't let them out of the house, they're essentially stuck at home. One thing that we have started doing is we've started making hand sanitizers and masks for communities in our office. So it's completely free of cost, but we're getting helpers to come in, make that, and then we're distributing it within the different communities. And just for those helpers coming in, they're getting out of that space, they're getting out of that prison that you described, just for a few hours every day, and you can see the difference. And I think it's some way of giving them some employment or something that they can do, maybe even sitting at home, that makes them feel useful, that makes them feel needed. And it's not just taking care of the kids or cooking for the family. And it can just get their mind off something.
Okay, so number two, I think more than mobile wallet transfers at the moment, you're suggesting some employment that they can do, some crafts that they can do, something physical that they can do, perhaps even on their phone, while they are grounded or under the lockdown. Jasmyn, what do you think about the second idea as a recommendation?
Look, I think that's a great idea. Absolutely, it's a great idea, and every little bit can help. But one idea that I'd really like to put forward is, again, at a government policy level, there needs to be some implementation, even if they don't have the funding. So when Imran Khan made his speech, okay, we are funding all kinds of ration, and if you are a private organization and you want to donate, we can connect you with a needy area. Simple. That's not using government money, but it's endorsing a cause.
It's creating a conduit, yeah.
All that needs to happen is something like a recognition, okay, this is taking place. We want to or have some semblance of investing in a safe house. And there's so many organizations at this time in the pandemic, in the early stages of the pandemic, who can and are donating. And also with Ramzan coming, and people can choose to actually fund places where women can go. And then what's happening is that we're then working with both sides of the coin. So we're managing donations that are not coming from the government money. And on the other hand, without money, we're still getting the government to endorse and speak about a cause like this. And every other government, or not every other, many other governments in the world right now are speaking about this. We had the Canadian PM speak about this, hotline set up. We had places in Greenland banned alcohol consumption because abuse rates were so high. We have countries in Europe speaking about this. It should be spoken about by our PM even if there is no funding, it can still facilitate a process.
Thank you so much for identifying that as a third recommendation. I basically have very effectively tried to create this awareness. Sadly, I don't know, somewhere in the middle of domestic worker shelters, we saw a rollback. I don't know if both of you are aware about that. So there were like these domestic violence shelters across the country, and some of them were closed up because they were made by the previous government. I think this is the time to sort of converge, like Jasmyn said, on what vices, ills, and crimes honestly happen in our society, right? During COVID, now we've realized what's actually killing people. It's like the house is the most violent place for a woman. So let's put your third recommendation in, and at the end of this podcast, I'll be tagging, once we post it, I'll be tagging some very good friends in the government who are keen on this cause, and request them to make these decisions. In summary, I think the first one is we'll be calling on domestic health workers to be counseled by health professionals, particularly mental health professionals. Secondly, we will call organizations to please give these domestic workers some work from home that they can earn while they're in lockdown. Either they come to a local community area with safe distancing, or they do something in their houses. And thirdly, just in your recommendation that we get the government to endorse domestic violence and ask them to either call a hotline or to call on organizations to bring this to an end, or create awareness. A lot of organizations, particularly the one I work for, have directed their advertising money towards awareness for COVID. And what's really important is that we can now, with the government, identify what those causes are, and they can direct their awareness towards domestic violence as well. So your last words, Suniya, and then Jasmyn, and we will then wrap up and put this up as soon as possible.
I'd just like to say, yesterday I was extremely depressed when I heard about what happened with these helpers coming in. Listening to this podcast, listening to the 3 measures, and hopefully connecting with people, I do see a glimmer of hope. We need to take the first step. We need to do it collectively. This is the way forward.
Jasmyn?
Okay, so first I'd like to thank you, Aisha, for having me here. I agree with Suniya, just having a platform like this adds help. And I think that with the 3 recommendations, one thing that actually really does add hope to this whole situation is that because the entire world is facing a collective stressor, we are actually looking at collective measures as well, meaning that one country implements something and another can mirror something helpful. And so if there was ever a time to really speak up against abuse because of a pandemic, the time is now. Whereas it's been so vastly ignored before, being a third world country with different cultural norms, but not every country is facing it because of a pandemic, that there's no better time for our government to also mirror that.
Thank you so much, Jasmyn. Thank you, Suniya. In the end, I think in conclusion, we all agree that domestic violence happens to anyone and everyone. We've either seen it or we've experienced it. What's important is not to internalize the violence, but to externalize it and verbalize it. And that is where it begins to end. We hope these 3 recommendations are taken up. We will be following it up, and we will be requesting journalists to please take these recommendations forward as well. Thank you, Suniya, and thank you, Jasmyn, for being part of this.